It is only with vast hastency and repugnance that I let my mind go back to Lake's camp and to what we really found there, and to the other thing beyond the frightful mountain wall. I am constantly tempted to shirk the details and to let hints stand for actual facts and incredible deductions. I hope I have said enough already to let me glide briefly over the rest. The rest, that is, of the horrors of the camp. I have told of the wind-ravaged terrain, the damaged shelters, the disarranged machinery, the varied uneasiness of our dogs, the missing sledges and other items, the death of men and dogs, the absence of Gedney, and the 6 insanely buried biological specimens, strangely sound in texture for all their structural injuries, from a world 40 million years dead. I do not recall whether I mentioned that upon checking on the canine bodies we found one dog missing. We did not think much about that till later. Indeed, only Danforth and I thought of it at all. The principal things I have been keeping back relate to the bodies and to the certain subtle points which may or may not lead to a hideous and incredible kind of rationale to the apparent chaos. At the time I tried to keep the men's minds off those points, for it was too much simpler, so much more normal, to lay everything to the outbreak of madness on the part of some of Lake's party. From the look of things, that demon mountain wind must have been enough to drive any man mad in the midst of the centre of all earthly mystery and desolation. The crowning abnormality, of course, was the condition of the bodies, men and dogs alike. They had all been in some terrible kind of conflict, and were torn and mangled in fiendishly, altogether inexplicable ways. Death, so far as we could judge, had in each case come from strangulation or laceration. The dogs had evidently started the trouble, for the state of their ill-built coral bore witness to its forcible breakages from within. It had been set some distance from the camp because of the hatred of the animals for those hellish archaean organisms, but the precaution seems to have been taken in vain. When left alone in that monstrous wind behind flimsy walls of insufficient height, they must have stampeded, whether from the wind itself or from some subtle increasing odour emitted by the nightmare specimens. One could not say. Those specimens, of course, had been covered with a tent cloth, yet the low Antarctic sun had beat steadily upon the cloth, and Lake had mentioned that the solar heat tended to make the strange sound and tough tissues of the things relax and expand. Perhaps the wind had whipped the cloth from over them and jostled them about in such a way that their more pungent olfactory qualities became manifest despite their unbelievable antiquity. But whether had happened, it was hideous and revolting enough. Perhaps I had better put squeamishes aside and tell the worst at last. Though with a categorical statement of opinion, based on first-hand observations of the most rigid deductions of both Danforth and myself, that the then missing Gendry was in no way responsible for the loathsome horrors that we found. I have said that the bodies were frightfully mangled. Now I must add that some were incised and subtracted from the most curious, cold-blooded and inhuman fashion. It was the same with dogs and men. All the healthier, fattier bodies, quadrupedal and bipedal, had the most solid masses of tissue cut out and removed, as by a careful butcher, and around them was a strange sprinkling of salt, taken from the ravaged position chests on the plains, which conjured up the most horrible associations. The thing had occurred in one of the crude airplane shelters from which the plane had been dragged out, and subsequent winds had affected all tracks which could have supplied any plausible story. Scattered bits of clothing and roughly slashed from the human incision objects hinted no clues. It is useless to bring up the half-impression of certain faint snow prints in one shielded corner of the ruined exposure, because that impression did not concern human prints at all, but was clearly mixed up with all the talk of fossil prints which poor Lake had been given throughout the preceding weeks. One had to be careful of one's imagination in the lee of those overshadowing mountains of madness. As I have indicated, Gedney and one dog turned out to be missing in the end, and we came on the terrible shelter. We had missing 2 dogs and 2 men, but the fairly unharmed dissecting tent, which we entered after investigating the mountainous graves, had something to reveal. It was not as Lake had left it, for the covered parts of the primal monstrosity had been removed from the improvised table. Indeed, we had already realised that one of the 6 imperfect and insanely buried things we had found, the one with the trace of the peculiar hateful odour, must represent the collected sections of the entity which Lake had tried to analyse. On and around that laboratory table were strewn other things, and it did not take long for us to guess what those things were, the careful and oddly, unexpectedly dissected parts of 1 man and 1 dog. I shall spare the feelings of the survivors by omitting the mention of the man's identity. Lake's anatomical instruments were missing, but there were evidences of the careful cleansing. The gasoline stove was also gone, though around it we found the curious litter of matches. We buried the other human parts beside the other 10 men, and the canine parts with the other 35 dogs. Concerning the bizarre smudges on the laboratory table and the jumble of roughly handled illustrated books scattered near it, we were much too bewildered to speculate. This formed the worst of the camp horror, but other things were equally perplexing. The disappearance of Gedney and the 1 dog, the 8 uninjured biological specimens, the 3 sledges, the certain instruments, illustrated technical and scientific books, writing materials, electrical torches and batteries, food and fuel, heating apparatus, spare tents, fur suits, and the like, was utterly beyond sane conjecture, as were likewise the splatter-fringed ink blots on certain pieces of paper, and the evidences of curious alien fumblings and experimentation around the planes and other mechanical devices, both at the camp and at the boring. The dogs seemed to abhor the oddly distorted machinery. Then, too, were the upsetting of the ladder and the disturbances of certain steeples, and jarringly comical heap of tin cans, parried open in the most unlikely ways and the most unlikely places. The profusion of scattered matches, intact, broken, or spent, formed another minor enigma, as did the 2 or 3 tent cloths and fur suits which were found lying about with peculiar and unorthodox slashing, conveniently due to clumsy efforts at unimaginable adaptations. The maltreatment of the human and canine bodies and the crazy burial of the damaged archaean specimens were all a piece of this apparent distinctive madness. In view of just such an eventuality as the present one, we carefully photographed all the main evidences of inside distorter in the camp. We shall use the prints to buttress the pleas against the departure of the proposed Starkweather Moor expedition. Our first act, after finding the bodies in the shelter, was to photograph and open the row of insane graves with the 5 pointed snow mounds. We could not help notice the resemblance of the monstrous mounds, with their clusters of grouped dots, to poor Lake's descriptions of the strange greenish soapstones. And then we came to some of the soapstones themselves. In the great mineral pile, we found the likeness very close indeed. The whole general formation, it must have been clear, seemed abominably suggestive of the starfish head of the archaean entities, and we agreed that the suggestion must have worked potently upon the sensitized mind of Lake's overwrought party. Our own first sight of the actual buried entities formed a horrible moment, and sent the imaginations of Peabody and myself back to some of the shocking primal myths we had read and heard. We all agree that the mere sight and continued presence of the things must have cooperated with the oppressive polar solitude and the demon mountain wind that driven Lake's party mad. For madness, centering in Gedney and the only possible surviving agent, was the explanation spontaneously adopted by everyone so far as spoken utterance was concerned, though I will not be so naive as to deny that each of us may have harbingered at guesses of the sanity forbid him to formulate completely. Sherman, Peabody and McTighe made an exhaustive airplane cruise over the surrounding territory this afternoon, sweeping the horizon with field glasses in quest of Gedney and the various missing things. But nothing came to light. The party reported that the Titan Barrier Range extended endlessly to the right and left the lake, without any diminution of height and essential structure. On some of the peaks, though, the regular cube and rampant formations were bolder and plainer, having doubtly fantastic similarities to Rorik's paintings' Asian hill ruins. The distribution of cryptical cave mouths on the black, snowy, denuded summits seemed roughly even as far as the range could be traced. In spite of all the prevailing horrors, we were left with enough sheer scientific zeal and adventurousness to wonder about the unknown realm beyond those mysterious mountains. As our guarded message stated, we rested at midnight after our day of terror and bafflement, but not without the tentative plan for one or more range-crossing altitude flights in a lightened plane with aerial camera and geologist outfits beginning the following morning. It was decided that Danforth and I try it first, and we awakened at 7 a.m. Intending an early trip through heavy winds mentioned in our brief bulletin to the outside world delayed our start to nearly 9 o'clock. I have already repeated the non-committal story we told at the men at the camp and relayed outside, after our return 16 hours later. It is now my terrible duty to amplify this account by filling in the merciful blanks with hints of what we really saw in the hidden transmutal world. Hints of the revelations which had finally driven Danforth to a nervous collapse. I wish he would add a really frank word about that thing which he thinks he alone saw, even though it was probably a nervous delusion, of which he was perhaps the last straw to put him where he is now, but he is firm against that. All I can do is repeat his later disjointed whispers about what sent him shrieking as the plane soared back through the wind-tortured mountain pass after the real and tangible shock which I shared. This will form my last word. If the plain signs of surviving elder horrors in which I disclose will not be enough to keep the others from melding with the inner Antarctic, or at least form preying too deeply beneath the surface of that ultimate waste of forbidden secrets and inhuman aeon-cursed desolation, the responsibility for unnameable and perhaps immeasurable evils will not be mine. Danforth and I studied the notes made by Peabody in this afternoon flight and checked up with the sextant and calculated that the lowest available pass in the range lay somewhat to the right of us, with sight of camp at around 23,000 or 24,000 feet above sea level. For this point, then, we first headed in the lightened plane as we embarked on our flight of discovery. The camp itself, on foothills which sprang from a height continental plateau, was some 12,000 feet in altitude, hence the actual height increase necessary was not so vast as it might seem. Nevertheless, we were actually conscious of the referred air in the intense cold as we rose, for on account of visibility conditions we had to leave the cabin windows open. We were dressed, of course, in our heaviest furs. As we drew near the forbidden peaks, dark and sinister above line of crevasse-ridden snow and interstelling glaciers, we noticed more and more of the curiously rectangular formations clinging to the slopes, and thought again of those strange Asian paintings by Nicholas Roerich. The ancient and wind-weathered rocks strathfully varied on all of Lake's bulletins, had provided those of the hoary principles and been towering up in exactly the same way since surprisingly early time in Earth's history, perhaps over 50 million years. How much higher had they once been? It was futile to guess, but everything about the strange region pointed to obscure atmospheric influences unfavourable to change, and calculated to retard the unusual climactic process of rock desegration. But it was the mountainside tangle of regular cubes, ramparts and cave mouths which fascinated and disturbed us most. I studied them with a field glass and took aerial photographs while Danforth drove and at times relieved him at the controls. Though my aviation knowledge was purely an amateur's, in order to let him use the binoculars. We could easily see that much of the material of the things was lightish Archean quartets, unlike any formation visible over the broad areas of general surface, and their regularity was extreme and uncanny to extent which poor Lake had scarcely hinted. As he said, the edges were crumbled and rounded from untold eons of savage weathering, but their preternatural solidity and tough materials had saved them from obliteration. Many parts, especially those closest to the slopes, seemed identical in substance with the surrounding rock surface. The whole arrangement looked like the ruins of Machu Picchu in the Andes and the primal foundation walls of Kesh as dug up by Oxford Field Museum expedition in 1929, and both Danforth and I obtained that occasional impression of sparsous cyclopean blocks which Lake had attributed to his flight companion Carol. How on account for such things in this place was frankly beyond me, and I felt queerly humbled as a geologist. Ingenious formations often have strange regularities, like the famous Giant's Causeway in Ireland, and the stupendous range despite Lake's original suspicion of smoking cones which was above all else non-volcanic in evident structure. The curious cave mouths which the odd formation seemed most abandoned presented another albeit and lesser puzzle because of their regularity of outline. They were, as Lake's bulletin had said, often approximately square and semicircular, as if the natural orifices had been shaped to greater symmetry by some magic hand. The numerousness and wide distribution was remarkable, and suggested that the whole region was honeycombed with tunnels dissolved out of the limestone strata. Such glimpses as we secured did not extend far within the caverns, but we saw that they were apparently clear of stalactites and stalagmites. Outside, those parts of the mountain slopes adjoining the aperture seemed invariably smooth and regular, and Danforth thought that the slight cracks and pittings of the weather tended towards unusual patterns, filled as he was with the horrors of strangeness discovered at the camp. He hinted that the pittings vaguely resembled those baffling groups of dots sprinkled over the primeval greenish soapstones, so hideously duplicated on the madly convinced snow mounds above 6 buried monstrosities. We had risen gradually and flying over the higher foothills and along towards the relatively low pass we had selected. As we advanced, we occasionally looked at the snow and ice and land route, wondering whether we could have attempted this trip with similar equipment of earlier days. Somewhat to our surprise, we saw that the terrain was far from difficult, as such things go, and despite the crevices and bad spots, and would not have been likely to deter the sledges of the Scott and Shackleton or Amundsen. Some of the glaciers appeared to have led up to the wind-barred passes with unusual continuity, and upon reaching the chosen pass we found that its case formed no exception. Our sensations of tense expectancy as we prepared to round the crest of the peer over the untrodden world can hardly be described on paper, even though we had no cause to think the regions beyond the range essentially different from those already seen and traversed. The touch of evil mystery in the barrier mountains and the beckoning sea of opalescent sky glimpsed betwixt the summits was a highly subtle and attenuated matter, not to be explained in literal words, rather was an affair of vague psychological symbolism and aesthetic association, a thing mixed up with exotic poetry and paintings, and with the archaic myths lurking in shunned and forbidden volumes. Even the wind's burden held a peculiar strain of conscious malignity. For a second it seemed that the composite sound, including a bizarre musical whistling or piping over the wide range, was a blast swept in and out of omnipresent and resonant cave mouths. There was a cloudy note of reminiscent repulsion in this sound, a complex unplaceable of any other dark impressions. We were now, after a slow ascent, at a height of 23,570 feet, according to the aneroid, and had left the region of clinging snow definitely behind us. Up here were only dark, bare rock slopes and the start of rough, rigged glaciers, but with those provocative cube ramparts and echoing caves mouths to add a potent of the unnatural, the fantastic and the dreamlike. Looking along a line of high peaks, I thought I could see one of them mentioned by Pearl Lake, the rampant exactly on top. It seemed to be half lost in a queer Antarctic haze, such a haze, perhaps, as had been responsible for Lake's early notion of volcanism. The pass loomed directly before us, smooth and windswept between its jagged and malignantly frowned pylons. Beyond it was a sky fretted with swirling vapours and lightened by the low polar sun, the sky of that mysterious farther realm upon us which we had not human eye ever gazed. A few more feet of altitude, and we would behold that realm. Danforth and I, unable to speak except in shouts amidst the howling, piping wind that raced through the pass and added to the noise of the unmuffled engines, exchanged equivalent glances. And then, having gained those last few feet, we did indeed stir across the momentous divide and over the unsampled secrets of an elder and utterly alien Earth.